The dog wouldn't stop. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the dress, black, simple, the kind women wear when they are done explaining their grief to strangers. Not the woman wearing it. Small, quiet, standing near the back of the memorial hall, the way people stand when they have learned that the best view of any room is the one no one else wants. Not even her stillness, which was a specific kind of stillness, the kind that has been trained into muscle and bone until it becomes indistinguishable from calm. It was the dog, a Belgian Malinois, tan and black, lean as a blade. She sat pressed against the woman's left leg, a worn leather leash looped once around a hand that hadn't needed to pull it all morning. And when Major General Conrad Stiles walked through the main entrance of Naval Special Warfare Memorial Hall, flanked by aides, chest armored in ribbons, moving with the gravity of a man who had never once been told to wait, the dog's head turned. The fur along her spine rose in a slow, deliberate ridge, and from somewhere deep in her chest came a sound that was not a bark. It was lower than that, steadier, a growl that did not stop. People looked at the dog, then at the woman holding the leash, then back at the general. The woman's expression did not change. Stiles noticed the dog, he noticed the woman, his jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree. Around them, 150 guests, Gold Star families, senior officers, journalists, chaplains, went very still in the way. Crowds go still when something invisible has just shifted beneath the floor. No one in that room understood what was happening, but Zara did, and in 20 minutes, so would everyone else. Naval Special Warfare Memorial Hall occupied the eastern wing of the Virginia Beach Naval Complex, a building designed with the kind of deliberate solemnity that architecture borrows from grief. American flags flanked a central stage where a ceremonial display featured the Naval Special Warfare Trident in polished bronze. The walls carried names, not ranks, not service numbers, just names, row after row, each one a complete life reduced to a single noun carved in stone. It was 9:45 a.m. on a Thursday in October, and the hall held the particular quality of sound that exists only in large rooms where many people are working very hard to be quiet. Elise Decker had arrived at 9:15. She had signed in at the registration desk without ceremony, accepted a printed program, and moved to a chair in the third row from the back on the left side, a position that gave her an unobstructed sightline to every entrance, every exit, every cluster of conversation, and the elevated stage where the day's official speakers would stand. She had done this without appearing to do it deliberately. She had done it the way people breathe, automatically, completely, without any visible thought. Zara settled at her left leg. Her leash was looped around Elise's left hand. Her body was still. The hall filled steadily. Families arrived in small, careful groups, wives with grown children, mothers with photographs clutched in both hands, fathers who stood with the particular rigidity of men who had decided before they left home that they would not cry in public and were now working very hard on that promise. Gold Star pins caught the light. A chaplain moved through the rows offering handshakes. 2 cameramen from a local news station set up along the right wall. Elise watched all of it from her seat without appearing to watch any of it. She was 32 years old. She had dark hair pulled back simply, no jewelry visible at the collar of her dress, and the kind of face that registers as unremarkable until you have been looking at it for several minutes and realize you cannot find a single thing about it that isn't composed. Not composed in the way of someone suppressing emotion, composed in the way of a room that has been arranged by someone who understands exactly where every object should be. The program listed her in the Gold Star family section. Mrs. Elise Decker, widow of Chief Petty Officer Ryan Decker, Naval Special Warfare Command, killed in action, Operation Nightfall, March of 2021. That was what the program said. That was what the seating chart said. That was what every name tag and registration record in the building said. Zara's nose moved twice along the floor, tracking something across the room. Then she settled again, chin resting on Elise's knee, eyes half closed. Major General Conrad Stiles entered at 9:47, 2 minutes ahead of his announced arrival time, which was itself a minor performance. Generals who arrive 2 minutes early are signaling that they don't belong to your schedule. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and was now simply authoritative. His dress uniform carried 3 rows of decorations, including 2 Distinguished Service Medals and a Combat Infantryman badge, and he moved through the crowd the way senior officers learn to move in formal settings, acknowledging without stopping, receiving without lingering, owning the room by never appearing to need anything from it. His aide, Captain Aaron Foster, walked half a step behind on his right. 2 junior officers flanked the rear. Stiles had been photographed shaking hands with 4 senators. He had testified before the Armed Services Committee regarding Special Operations Force restructuring. He had approved the operational planning framework for 7 joint missions in the preceding 18 months, one of which had been called Operation Nightfall, and one of which had resulted in a casualty rate that the official after-action review had classified at a level that required special clearance to read. He did not appear to be thinking about any of that as he entered the hall. He was thinking about the dog. The growl was low but consistent, the kind of sound that doesn't build or fade but simply maintains itself, steady as a held note. Stiles heard it within 4 steps of the entrance. His gaze moved to the source, a Belgian Malinois, seated against the left leg of a woman in the 3rd row from the back, facing his direction. The woman was looking elsewhere. The dog was not. Stiles leaned toward Foster and said something without moving his head. Foster nodded, peeled away, and approached the row where Elise sat. "Ma'am?" Foster kept his voice neutral and low. "I apologize for the interruption. We've received a concern about the animal in the hall. Is there someone who can take her outside during the ceremony?" Elise looked up at him. Her expression was attentive and entirely unhurried. "She's fine," Elise said. "She'll settle." Foster glanced at Zara, who had not in any visible way settled. "I understand, ma'am, but General Stiles has—" "She's documented as an emotional support animal," Elise said. She produced a single folded document from her small bag and held it out. "All clearances are in order." Foster took the document, read it, returned it, looked at the dog once more. Zara's low growl had not shifted in frequency or intensity since Stiles entered the building. "I'll let the general know," Foster said, and returned to his position. Stiles received the message with a controlled tightening of his expression. He was in a room with journalists, Gold Star families, and 3 flag officers of varying rank. He was not going to make a scene over a dog. He moved to his designated seat in the front row and opened his program with the practiced ease of a man who did not let anything show. Zara continued growling. "Before we go any further, if you've ever felt like the quietest person in the room was also the most dangerous, you're in exactly the right place. This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories where the truth walks in through the side door, dressed in morning black, holding a leash. If that's the kind of story you're here for, hit subscribe right now and ring that notification bell, because we drop new episodes every week, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Colonel Diana Sutton found Elise 11 minutes into the reception period before the formal program began. Sutton was 47, impeccably turned out, the kind of woman who had spent a career translating military hierarchy into social architecture and was very good at it. She carried a clipboard she didn't need in the way some people carry props. It was not for taking notes, it was for projecting purpose. "Mrs. Decker." Her smile was practiced and not unkind. "I wanted to personally check in. Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable today?" "I'm fine, thank you," Elise said. "Of course." Sutton's eyes moved to Zara, then back to Elise. "I noticed you're seated in the general seating area. We do have a designated section for Gold Star family members closer to the stage if you'd prefer." "I have a reserved seat," Elise said. She indicated the small printed card on the seat beside her. "E. Decker, VIP family. 1st row, left section." Sutton looked at the card. Her smile remained exactly where it was. "Of course," she said again. "We'll make sure you're well taken care of." She moved away, and Elise watched her go with the same unhurried attention she'd given everyone else. Then she looked back at the stage. The chair arrangements were precise. The lighting was warm. Someone had placed a single white lily at the base of each name panel along the wall. 3 rows behind Elise, an old man with a scar along the right side of his neck had been watching the exchange with Sutton. He was in his mid-60s, wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, with the deliberate non-uniform quality of a man who had worn uniforms for so long that civilian clothes felt like a disguise. His hands were folded on his knees. His eyes, when they moved the way trained eyes move, in arcs, not lines, sweeping rather than searching. His name was Logan Hayes, and he had last seen a Belgian Malinois with that exact build and that exact coloring in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, in November of 2019, and he had last seen her working with a handler he knew only by radio frequency and a single-syllable call sign that was never spoken above a half voice. He had never seen that handler's face. He looked at Elise Decker's profile. He looked at Zara. He looked at Elise again. He did not move from his seat. Lieutenant Kyle Brennan approached Elise's row at 9:58. He was 29, military bearing, the kind of efficiency that comes not from experience but from wanting very much to appear experienced. He carried a tablet. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Brennan, event coordination. I need to verify the documentation for the animal." He glanced at Zara. "Standard protocol for indoor memorial events. Nothing unusual." "Of course." Elise produced the same document she had given Foster. Brennan reviewed it with genuine thoroughness. Then, "This lists her as an emotional support animal. Can you tell me about her training background?" "She's certified through a licensed provider. It's in the documentation." "Right." Brennan tapped something on his tablet. "There's a notation here about a prior injury, left mandible. Any ongoing medical concerns we should be aware of?" "Left mandible, shrapnel contact, Kandahar province, November of 2019, Elise said. "Veterinary records are on file with the registration desk. She was cleared for indoor events by her vet 8 months ago." Brennan looked up. He had not mentioned the injury's cause or location. He had mentioned only that there was a notation. The level of specific recall Elise had just displayed, province, month, year, injury type, was not the kind of thing a pet owner normally carried ready indexed in their memory. It was the kind of thing a handler carried. Brennan looked at Elise for a moment longer than his task required. Then he looked at his tablet. Then he said, "Thank you, ma'am. Everything appears to be in order." And he walked away with the particular posture of a man who was going to think about a conversation for the rest of the day and not yet understand why. Behind Elise, Logan Hayes had watched the exchange without appearing to. His thumb moved once across the surface of the challenge coin he'd been holding in his right palm, a coin that had been in his pocket every day for the past 4 years, and he said nothing. The formal program began at 10:00 hours. Chaplain Robert Hale approached the podium first, a lean man in his 50s with the gravity of someone who had performed too many services like this one to treat any of them lightly. He led a brief opening prayer that managed to be inclusive without being vague, and then the hall went quiet in the way it does when a program officially begins, a different kind of quiet than before, structured rather than held. Colonel Sutton approached the podium next and began the reading of names. It was a long list. Each name received its full service record, rank, unit designation, date of death, location. The names fell into the room one by one, and the room received them the way rooms receive such things, with a particular held tension that is not silence exactly, but is silence's close relative. When Sutton reached the D section, she read, "Chief Petty Officer Ryan Decker, Naval Special Warfare Command, Detachment 7, killed in action. Operation Nightfall, March 14, 2021, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan." Elise closed her eyes. She kept them closed for 3 seconds. Not the 3 seconds of grief, not the kind that requires effort to contain, not the kind that comes in waves and threatens edges. 3 precise seconds. The way a sniper accounts for wind before a shot, the way a pilot runs a final check before descent. Then her eyes opened, and she was looking at the stage again, and her face was exactly as it had been, and her right hand had moved to rest on Zara's back in a way that looked like comfort and functioned like something more specific. A woman in the row ahead had begun to cry quietly. 2 rows to the right, a man in his 60s pressed a photograph against his chest. These were the sounds and shapes of grief as most people experience it. Present tense, uncalculated, real. Elise watched the stage. Logan Hayes watched Elise. Staff Sergeant Owen Farley found her during the brief recess between the reading of names and the first keynote address. He was the hall's senior security coordinator, a blocky man in his late 40s who had spent 22 years in the Army before transitioning to event security, and had brought all of his army sensibility with him intact, including the conviction that when a superior indicated that something needed to be addressed, you addressed it. The general had indicated that the dog situation needed addressing. "Ma'am." Farley's tone was not hostile. It was the tone of a man who had made a decision and was now communicating it. "I need to ask you to step outside with the animal. The general has authorized me to explain that her presence is creating a disturbance to the proceeding." Elise looked at him. "She's not creating a disturbance," Elise said. "Ma'am, she's been growling persistently since—" "She's creating a record." Elise's voice was very quiet. It was not whispering. It was the specific volume of someone who has chosen exactly how far their words need to travel. "Those are two different things." Farley paused. He had been given instructions, and those instructions covered most situations, but they did not cover this particular response, and he was aware that the nearest journalists were approximately 20 feet away and had functional ears. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need—" "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." The words weren't dismissive. They were final, the kind of final that comes from someone who isn't worried about whether you agree with them. Farley held his position for 2 seconds more, then retreated to the hall's perimeter to find Major Trent Reed. Reed was 38 and wore the easy confidence of someone who had spent his career managing how other people appeared to the public. He was the communications officer attached to Stiles' staff, and he understood that the situation with the widow and the growling dog had now been noticed by at least 2 camera operators, 1 print journalist, and a significant portion of the civilian attendees. He understood that undefined situations become their own narrative if you don't shape them. He approached Elise with the kind of warmth that is actually a form of pressure. "Mrs. Decker," he said, "I want to start by saying that your being here today is genuinely meaningful. The families you're sitting among have so much respect for what your family has sacrificed. A beat. I also want to be transparent with you. This event is being recorded for the Naval Community's official archive, and there's a possibility that the dynamic right now could generate a narrative that might not serve the families well. I'd hate for anything to distract from the purpose of today." Elise looked at him for a moment with the same expression she'd given everyone else. "I appreciate the concern," she said. "I'll stay where I am." Reed held his smile. Of course. I just want to make sure you feel—" "I do," she said. "Thank you." Reed stepped back. He found the nearest camera operator and confirmed that the cameras currently running were catching audio from the general floor. He typed a message on his phone. He did not look pleased. 3 rows back, Logan Hayes had watched Reed's approach and retreat with the particular attention of a man cataloging information he doesn't yet have context for. He had been watching Elise Decker for 40 minutes. He had identified the following: the way she had scanned the room on entry using a wall-to-wall arc rather than the natural focal point drift of a civilian. The fact that her seated posture maintained a straight spine, not through tension, but through habit. The specific habit of someone who has spent years in positions where slumping is operationally inadvisable. The way she had responded to every approach, Foster, Sutton, Brennan, Farley, Reed, with a measured economy that was not rudeness or coldness, but was the recognizable bearing of someone who had been trained that words are equipment and equipment should not be wasted. And the dog above everything. Zara was not an emotional support animal. Logan had seen enough working K9 units to know that the muscle distribution across her hindquarters, the specific way she tracked the room, the precise positioning of her body relative to Elise's left side, these were not traits that emerged from a licensed emotional support program. These were traits from a different kind of program entirely, the kind that did not advertise, the kind attached to units whose designations did not appear in public records. Logan turned the challenge coin in his palm. SDU-7. He had served there for 3 years before his hearing had been taken partially by an IED in Helmand and before Ryan Decker had made the choice that put his name on a stone wall in Virginia Beach. He had known every operator in Detachment 7 by voice, by gait, by the weight of their footsteps on gravel at 2 a.m. He had known every K9 unit by their handlers' commands and their particular response patterns. He thought he knew this dog. And the thought arrived with the careful uncertainty of someone who understood the weight of being wrong, that he might know who this woman was. He was not ready to act on that thought yet. The formal program resumed at 10:22. The second section of the ceremony featured video testimonials from surviving family members, a brief documentary sequence covering the history of naval special warfare, and a period during which photographs of the fallen were displayed on the screen above the stage. The photographs came in alphabetical order. When Ryan Decker's photograph appeared, a formal service portrait, dress blues, age 30, the particular expression of someone who had been asked to hold still for a camera and was doing his best with the instruction, Elise did not look away. She did not move. Her breathing, already controlled, did not visibly change, but her right hand, resting on Zara's back, shifted. It was a small movement, a closing of 3 fingers into the fur at the base of Zara's neck, a specific pressure applied at a specific point. Not a pet, not a comfort stroke, a grip. Zara responded instantly. Her head came up from the floor. She looked at Elise's face. Then she looked forward. Then she lowered her chin back to Elise's knee, slowly, and the quality of her attention shifted in a way that was almost impossible to describe, less watchful, more gathered, like a soldier moving from scan to hold. Logan Hayes saw it. He had seen canine handlers communicate with their dogs across a lifetime of operational experience. He had seen the hand signals and the pressure cues and the voice commands that most people never learned to read. What he had just seen was not a woman comforting her pet during a difficult moment. What he had just seen was a handler issuing a specific tactical instruction to a working dog who understood it completely. He stood up very slowly. He moved forward along the outside aisle, keeping to the wall until he was level with Elise's row. He paused. Then he sat in the empty chair at the end of her row, 4 seats to her right, without invitation. He did not look at her. He looked at the screen. After a moment, without turning his head, he said very quietly, "That's a JSOC working dog. I'd know that build and that handling anywhere." Elise did not respond. She watched the screen. "SDU-7's K9 unit," Logan said. The words were barely sound. They existed at the bottom register of human speech, the place where sound becomes more vibration than noise. There was a handler they called Vale. Nobody ever saw her face. Elise was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then she said, without inflection, "You should drink some water, Chief. It's warm in here." It was not a denial. It was also not a confirmation. It was a sentence that meant nothing on its surface and carried everything beneath it, the kind of response that only 2 kinds of people give, and those 2 kinds are people who have been trained to give nothing away, and people who have been trained to give nothing away. Logan nodded once, very slightly as though she had answered a question she hadn't been asked. He reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a coin, small, military weight, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. He set it on the armrest between them without looking at it. On one face, an eagle over a trident. On the reverse, a number, 7. Then he stood up and returned to his row. Elise looked at the coin for 2 seconds. Her right index finger touched it once, a contact that was too precise to be accidental and too brief to be anything someone would notice. She left it where it was. 2 rows ahead, Major Reed had observed Logan's movement through the room and was now speaking quietly into his phone. Farley received the message at 10:31 and began a quiet navigation toward the hall's side entrance where his contact at the Naval Security Service had confirmed a response. The background check on Elise Decker had been initiated. At 10:34, the check returned. The result was clean. Elise Decker, civilian, no service record. Widow of CPO Ryan Decker. No flags, no prior incidents, no connection to any active operational program. Farley delivered the result to Stiles during a 2-minute recess between program segments, leaning close while the general reviewed his notes. Stiles received the information with the controlled satisfaction of someone who has been uncertain and is now certain. He looked across the room at Elise, who was accepting a glass of water from a passing volunteer with a brief nod of thanks. He had been right. She was nobody. A widow with a difficult dog and possibly a difficult attitude. After the ceremony, Reed would manage the optics, and by tomorrow this would be a non-story. He settled back into his chair with the ease of a man who had just put something down. He did not know that the clearance level required to access Elise Decker's real service record was 3 tiers above his own. He did not know that the Naval Security Service's background check system had encountered a wall at the 3rd layer of her file and returned a clean civilian result, not because there was nothing there, but because what was there was not accessible to a 2-star general, regardless of what he commanded. He did not know any of that, but Elise knew that he didn't know. And she had known when she accepted the invitation to today's ceremony that he would check and that the check would return exactly what it returned. She had planned for this. She had planned for everything. That was the thing about Elise Decker. She had been planning for this morning for 3 years, and every person who had tried to remove her from this room today had been executing their role in a sequence she had already written. Even the growl. Especially the growl. The keynote address began at 10:45, and Major General Conrad Stiles took the podium with the ease of a man who had given 100 speeches in rooms like this one. He was, whatever else he was, an effective public speaker. He understood pacing. He understood when to slow down and when to let silence do work. He understood the difference between tribute and performance, and he navigated the line between them with the skill of someone who had spent a career in rooms, where how you appeared was almost as important as what you did. Today we gather not because loss requires a location, he began, but because memory does. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about the obligation of the living to carry forward what the fallen left behind. He spoke about the meaning of the Trident, what it cost to earn, what it required to keep. He spoke, in the measured language of ceremony, about what it meant for families to hold the weight of service that cannot be fully described to those who have not carried it. He was eloquent and he was convincing, and a significant portion of the room was genuinely moved by what he was saying. Then he said, Operation Nightfall stands as an example of everything that our special operations community does right. The men who served in that mission demonstrated the highest standards of courage, coordination, and commitment to one another. Their sacrifice was not without meaning. Their sacrifice was a demonstration of what this community is capable of and what it stands for. Zara growled. It was louder this time. Not aggressive, not a lunge or a snap, but fuller, more present, a sound that moved through the room's ambient noise the way a radio frequency cuts through static. Several heads turned. A child in the front row looked around for the source. The journalist from the news station shifted her camera angle. Elise did not pull the leash. Logan Hayes, 3 rows back, had gone very still. Stiles paused at the podium. His gaze found Elise's row. He held it for exactly 2 seconds, the particular duration of a man deciding whether to acknowledge something publicly, and then continued, with the discipline that long-practiced speakers develop when disruptions threaten their rhythm. But something had shifted in the room. The name Operation Nightfall had landed differently now than it had during the reading of names. During the reading, it had been one entry in a long list, received with the solemnity due to all entries. In the general's speech, delivered with approval and accomplishment in his voice, the name had been met with the dog's low, steady answer. And the room, without knowing why, had noticed that those two things were in some way connected. Stiles concluded his address at 11:03. The applause was genuine and warm. He stepped down from the podium with a nod to Chaplain Hale, who was managing the program from the front row, and accepted a handshake from a senior officer in the second row. Then he walked toward Elise. He did not take the long road around. He came directly, skirting 2 rows, arriving at the end of her aisle. He stopped 4 feet from her, and when he spoke, his voice was not for the room. It was pitched for the distance between 2 people and no further. Mrs. Decker. His tone was controlled and calibrated. Not aggressive, but absolute. The tone of someone who had given hundreds of subordinates their final instructions. I don't know what your intention is with this, but this is a memorial service. These families deserve respect, and this animal is... I agree completely, General, Elise said. He had not finished his sentence. She had not interrupted it. She had simply completed it ahead of him, which was a different thing, and carried a different implication. Stiles recognized it the way he would recognize an unexpected tactical formation, with attention and recalibration. Zara, at Elise's side, held his gaze with the steadiness of an animal that has been trained to hold exactly this kind of eye contact. After the program, Stiles said, I want you and I to have a direct conversation, outside. I'll be available, Elise said. He held her gaze for a beat. Then he turned and walked back to the front section with the measured stride of a man who was not leaving but relocating, which is different. Elise watched him go. Then she looked at the challenge coin still resting on the armrest beside her. She picked it up, turned it once in her fingers, and placed it in her palm. She closed her hand around it. Behind her, Logan Hayes had been watching the exchange. He had seen the general's posture, not the public posture, the private one, the one that appears in the 18 inches of space between a superior and a subordinate when no one outside that radius is supposed to see it. He had seen the way Elise had received that posture, without flinching, without yielding, without performing indifference. He had seen that stance before, not in this room, not in a ceremony, in a communications debrief in 2021, 4 days after Operation Nightfall, when the mission's sole survivor, which was himself, had been asked to describe the voice of the asset who had held the overwatch position during the extraction. Low, he had told the debriefer. Not quiet. Low. Like someone who'd decided the right volume for everything they needed to say and wasn't interested in revising it. He was hearing that voice again now. If you can feel the tension building right now, it's if something about this woman isn't adding up for you the same way it isn't adding up for the people in that room. That's exactly the feeling this channel is built on. We tell the stories that official records don't. Hit that like button if you're still here, because the algorithm needs to know this story deserves to be seen. And if someone in your life has ever been underestimated, share this with them. They'll know exactly why. Logan stood from his seat a second time. He moved forward along the wall, more directly this time, with the purpose of a man who has finished deciding. He reached the end of Elise's row. He sat, not at the far end this time, but in the chair directly beside her. He kept his eyes on the front of the room. "I know where that dog has been," he said. The words were barely breath. "I know the unit she worked with. I know the operation her handler ran in November of Hai Ngin Kong Trum Mui Chin, and I know the one in March of Hai Ngin Kong Trum Hai Mui Mot." A pause. "I was in the extraction team. 4 years ago I gave a debrief about a voice on an encrypted frequency that pulled my team out of a position that should have killed all of us." Elise did not move. "Your voice," Logan said, "sounds exactly like that voice." Silence. Not the ceremony's silence. This was the silence between two people who have recognized something. "You should get back to your seat, Chief," Elise said. Still that low, precise volume. Still that specific economy. "Yes, ma'am," Logan said. He stood. As he passed behind her chair, he set something on the armrest. A second coin, this one newer, its edge sharper. He continued to his row without looking back. Elise looked at the second coin. Different face, same number on the reverse. 7. Major Trent Reed, who had been watching Logan's movement from the perimeter, crossed the room and stopped beside Logan's row. "Chief," Reed said quietly, "I need to ask you to remain in your assigned seat for the duration of the program. The general has requested—" "Understood, Major," Logan said. He sat down. He placed both hands on his knees. He looked at the stage. Reed returned to his position. Farley, standing near the center aisle, received a message on his phone at 11:17. He read it twice. Then he walked to the side corridor and made a call. At 11:23 he returned and found Reed. "Background check is clean," Farley said. "Civilian, no service record." Reed nodded. He looked at Elise's back from across the room. He looked at Stiles, who was seated and reading something from his portfolio in preparation for the reception following the ceremony. "Keep the cameras on the stage," Reed said. "Whatever happens with the widow, we don't want it in the record." Farley nodded and moved to speak to the camera operators. He did not know, none of them knew, that the access level required to retrieve Elise Decker's real service history was not achievable from any terminal in this building. That the record existed in a system to which a 2-star general's clearance did not reach. That the clean return they had received was not a complete return, but a truncated one, cut off at a wall they hadn't recognized as a wall because it looked exactly like a floor. They thought they had confirmed she was nobody. They had confirmed only that they did not have the clearance to find out who she was. At 11:26, the formal program entered its final segment before the general's closing address. The lights in the hall dimmed slightly for a final video tribute. In the softer light, faces were less distinct, postures more relaxed. In this moment, Logan reached into his jacket one final time. He leaned forward as though adjusting his position in his seat, and as he did, his arm extended back and his hand deposited something on the rear armrest of Elise's row. Not her armrest this time, but the one on the opposite end, just within reach if she shifted. A folded piece of paper, very small, very precise fold. He settled back. Elise did not move toward it immediately. She sat through the video tribute the way she had sat through everything. Present, contained, oriented forward. When the lights came back to full at 11:31, in the natural adjustment that follows, she shifted slightly in her seat, the movement of someone resettling, and her right hand moved to the armrest and came back with the folded paper, which disappeared into her palm in the same motion. She did not unfold it in the hall. She did not need to. She had written the contents herself 3 years ago in the form of a mission brief, and she already knew every word of it. What she needed to know was whether Logan had the version she had left for him, the version she had deposited in a classified dead drop in January of the previous year, under the access code that only one person in SDU-7's surviving roster had ever been given the clearance to retrieve. The fact that he had produced a document in this room told her the answer was yes. It told her also that she was no longer doing this alone. Above the stage, the final slide of the tribute program was still visible. A photograph of Ryan Decker taken in the field, not the formal portrait. A candid shot, caught mid-sentence, laughing at something someone had just said. He was 30 years old. He had been 30 years old for 2 years in that photograph, perpetually mid-laugh, perpetually mid-sentence. Elise looked at it. For the first time in the entire morning, her composed expression shifted by a fraction. Not to grief exactly, and not to anything that could be named easily. The fraction of a degree that separates a trained professional from the person underneath the training, visible only for a second, only to someone watching closely. Then the slide changed, and her face settled back, and she was looking at the stage again with the same contained attention she had maintained for the past 112 minutes. Zara, at her left leg, was absolutely still. In the front row, Major General Conrad Stiles was reviewing his notes for the closing address. Around him, the hall held its gathered quiet, 150 people arranged in rows under a ceiling that bore witness to nothing and everything. The morning had proceeded exactly as planned, just not according to anyone's plan but Elise's. Stiles stood and adjusted his uniform. He approached the podium. He set his notes down with the confidence of a man who would not need them. He did not look at the woman in the third row from the back on the left side. He had her confirmed as a civilian. He had her contained. After the ceremony, the conversation outside, and she would understand that her dog would not be welcome at future events. That was the plan. He opened his mouth to begin. That was when the hand reached forward, not Elise's hand, the hand of the man standing at the entrance to the hall, at the side door that Stiles had not been watching because his focus was on the podium, on the room, on the cameras and the families and the ceremony proceeding as designed. The man who entered through that side door was wearing a uniform, admiral's stars, a chest of decorations that made Stiles's own look modest, and 3 steps behind her, because it was not a man but a woman, and she was not entering from outside the ceremony. She had been inside the ceremony since 9:32, standing near the tall windows at the hall's eastern wall in a dark overcoat that, when she reached up now and removed it, revealed a full dress uniform beneath. 3 steps behind her was nothing because no one was behind her. She was Rear Admiral Patricia Norris, Director of Naval Special Warfare Programs, and she did not need anyone behind her. She stepped forward from the window line, and the quality of the room's air changed in the particular way it changes when someone with institutional authority makes themselves known. Officers in the room straightened. A few went to standing attention without being asked. Stiles at the podium went still. Norris had not said anything yet. She was simply standing in her uniform in a room where she had been standing invisibly for 2 hours, and her stillness now was different from her stillness before in the way that revealed objects are different from hidden ones. She looked at Elise. Elise looked at her. In the third row from the back, the woman in black sat with her hands folded in her lap, and a challenge coin and a folded paper and a dog that had not moved from her left side since 9:15 that morning. She was waiting. She had been waiting for 3 years. She was almost done. The room did not understand what it was looking at yet. That was the particular quality of the next 30 seconds. A room full of people who could see exactly what was happening and had not yet assembled it into meaning. Rear Admiral Patricia Norris stood in her full dress uniform at the eastern wall of the hall, and the officers nearest to her were coming to attention with the instinctive response of trained personnel recognizing rank, and the civilians nearest to her were looking with the curious attention of people who have registered that something has changed without knowing what or why. and Major General Conrad Stiles was standing at the podium with both hands flat on its surface, in the way a man stands when his balance has been interrupted, and he is deciding in real time whether to acknowledge that. Norris did not move toward the podium. She moved toward the third row from the back on the left side, which was where Elise Decker was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and a Belgian Malinois pressed against her left leg, and the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a cue and has just received it. The distance between the eastern wall and the third-to-last row was approximately 40 feet. Norris covered it in the measured stride of someone who understood that how you cross a room is a statement, and she was making one. The room tracked her movement, not all of it, not all at once, but in the spreading wave that follows any authority moving against the expected current of a formal event, Stiles said from the podium. Admiral Norris. Norris did not look at him. She stopped at the end of Elise's row. She looked at the woman in black. She looked at the dog. She looked at the challenge coin resting on the armrest. "Mrs. Decker," she said. Her voice was sized for the room, not amplified, not performing, simply calibrated for the distance to the farthest wall. "I'm sorry for the wait." "No need," Elise said. The exchange was 8 words, and it reconfigured every interaction that had preceded it in the past 2 hours, retroactively, the way a final piece of evidence reconfigures everything you thought you understood about a case. Every person who had approached Elise that morning, Foster, Sutton, Brennan, Farley, Reed, had done so with the assumption that she was a civilian who needed managing. Norris had just walked 40 feet across a room full of senior officers and apologized to her for the wait. That was not how admirals addressed civilians. Stiles came down from the podium. Not hurrying, he was too practiced for that, but with a purposefulness that arrived slightly ahead of his words. "Admiral, this isn't part of the scheduled..." "General." Norris turned to look at him for the first time, and her voice dropped by 1 precise degree, the register that carries absolute institutional weight without any of the performance that usually accompanies it. "I'll need a moment with this ceremony before your closing address. Please remain available." Stiles stopped moving. He was a 2-star general with 31 years of service and a record that included combat commands on 2 continents. He had not been told to remain available by anyone in this room or adjacent to it since his last promotion hearing. The instruction landed with the specific weight of words that carry more information than their surface. He remained available. He stood near the second row, and his hands were at his sides, and his expression was the controlled expression of a man who did not yet know enough to determine how concerned he should be. Reed, from the hall's perimeter, was watching with the focused attention of someone whose professional function is to manage situations, and who has just recognized that the situation has moved beyond his management. He reached for his phone, then stopped. Cameras were running. Whatever he said into a phone right now would be visible. He lowered his hand. Norris turned back to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and the room went quiet with the speed that rooms go quiet for someone with stars on their collar. "I want to thank you for your presence today, and for the respect you've shown these families. I'm going to take a brief moment to add something to the program that is long overdue." She looked at Elise. "Chief Warrant Officer Decker," she said, "if you're willing." The room heard those 4 words, and the room did something that rooms don't do in ceremonies. It made a sound. Not a gasp, not a collective exclamation, but the layered exhale of collective comprehension arriving unevenly, in pieces, spreading from the people closest to Norris outward through the rows until it reached the walls. Chief Warrant Officer. Not Mrs. Not Elise. Chief Warrant Officer. Sutton, in the second row, turned to look at the woman she had steered toward the civilian family section 2 hours ago. Brennan, near the side wall, looked at his tablet, then at Elise, then back at his tablet as though the device might provide clarification. Farley stood very still near the center aisle. Reed's hand had stopped moving entirely. Elise stood. She did it the way she had done everything that morning. Without announcement, without ceremony, with the precise economy of a person who has made a decision and is now executing it. She rose from her chair, and Zara rose with her, and the 2 of them stood in the aisle with the particular quality of a unit that has been waiting for orders and has received them. And then it happened. Stiles, who had been standing near the second row watching Norris and calculating, took 2 steps toward Elise. His voice was low and controlled, but his posture had shifted from available to something adjacent to intervention. "Mrs. Decker." He was close enough now that it might have appeared to anyone not watching carefully as a conversation rather than what it was. Whatever this is, and this is not the place, and I am telling you directly that. His hand moved toward her shoulder. The contact was not violent. It was the particular contact of someone who has used physical proximity as authority for so long that it has become reflex. The same hand had directed subordinates for decades. Not hitting, not grabbing, just touching. That specific small force that says, I am larger than you in ways that matter. Elise turned. The movement was not a flinch, and it was not a retreat. It was a pivot, a rotation at the hip that redirected the incoming vector of his arm while simultaneously repositioning her body weight, smooth and total, the way water redirects around a stone. Styles's hand met no shoulder because the shoulder was no longer there. He took a half step forward into the space she had vacated, his balance briefly compromised, and in that brief moment his forearm made contact with the chain at Elise's collar. It was a thin platinum chain, worn under the dress all morning, visible only as a slight elevation of fabric at the neckline. His sleeve caught it as he recovered his balance, and the clasp, stressed by the unexpected tension, came open. The chain pulled free of the collar. It dropped forward, swinging from the point where Styles's sleeve had snagged it, and then releasing, falling clear, landing against the front of Elise's dress where the neckline opened. What hung from the chain was not large. It was the size of a thumb, metal, worn to the soft patina of something handled many times. A Naval Special Warfare Trident, the anchor, the pistol, the trident, the eagle, in the unmistakable form given to those who have earned the right to carry it. Not given, not inherited, earned. The reverse face was visible from the angle of the nearest camera, and it carried an engraving in laser-cut characters too small to read across the room, but legible to anyone within 3 feet. NSW Gatch, Noi DEVGRU Gatch, Noi F Gatch, Noi Bay Gatch, Noi VEIL Get, Noi ACTIVE. 3 seconds. That was how long it took for the room to understand what it was seeing. 3 seconds during which the only sounds were the ambient systems of the building, climate control, the faint hum of the recording equipment, the fractional sound of 150 people not breathing. Logan Hayes was the first to move. He had been on his feet already, positioned at the end of his row, and when the chain fell and the trident became visible, he had the recognition of a man who has been suspecting something for 2 hours and has just seen the final piece land. He moved forward into the aisle, and when he reached the point level with Elise's row, he did something that required no explanation to anyone in the room who had served. He went to one knee, not both knees, one, the specific gesture of a military person rendering respect to a superior, not as a performance but as a reflex of the body acknowledging something the mind had been assembling since 9:45 that morning. He was a chief petty officer with 26 years of service, and he was kneeling in the center aisle of Naval Special Warfare Memorial Hall, and his eyes were on Elise Decker, and his face carried the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a debt for 4 years and has just identified the creditor. The silence in the room broke apart, not into noise, into the layered compound of multiple reactions occurring simultaneously. A sharp intake of breath from the journalist near the right wall, the sound of a chair moving as someone stood without deciding to stand, the particular audio of camera equipment repositioning, the smooth mechanical adjustment of a lens finding a new focal point. Styles had stepped back. His arm was at his side. His face, which had been authoritative and controlled for the entirety of the morning, was doing something it was not accustomed to doing. It was showing something, not guilt, not yet, something anterior to guilt, the expression of someone whose certainty has just been removed from under them, the way a floor looks when it is no longer reliable. Rear Admiral Norris had not moved from where she stood. She watched the room's reaction the way someone watches a calculation resolve, not with surprise, because she had known the outcome before she stepped forward, but with the particular attention of someone confirming that a thing has landed correctly. She waited 4 full seconds for the room's first wave of reaction to complete. Then she said into the hall's charged quiet, Chief Warrant Officer Elise Decker, call sign, Vale, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Female Operator Program, Detachment 7, active duty, classified operational status. She said it clearly and without inflection, the way you state a record for the record. She is also, Norris continued, the sniper lead for Operation Nightfall. The name had a different effect this time than it had during the reading, different even than when Styles had used it in his address. The third time a word is spoken in a room, it carries the weight of everything that has surrounded it. And Operation Nightfall now carried the weight of a growling dog and a turned shoulder and a trident falling out of a black dress at a Gold Star memorial. Colonel Sutton had stood. She was not standing to attention. She was standing the way people stand when sitting has become untenable, when the body requires more altitude than a chair provides to process what is happening. Brennan had placed his tablet face down on the seat beside him. His hands were at his sides. Farley had moved 3 steps toward the nearest wall, the instinctive positioning of a man removing himself from the center of something he has been wrong about. Reed was looking at the cameras, then at Norris, then at the cameras again. The calculation he was running was visible on his face. How to manage this, who could be called, what the optics were, and the calculation was returning nothing useful, and he was realizing this in real time. In the front row, a woman named Sarah Kimball, 29 years old, widow of Petty Officer First Class Daniel Kimball, killed in Operation Nightfall, sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Elise Decker. Daniel had come home from 3 deployments and had not come home from the 4th, and no one had told her why with any specificity because the specificity was classified and she had spent 2 years being told that her husband had died serving his country, which was true, and being told nothing beyond that, which was a container with everything removed from inside it. She was looking at the woman who had been there. She was looking at the woman who had tried to hold the line, her hands, in her lap, uncurled. Norris spoke for the next 4 minutes without notes and without pause, in the clear factual register of someone entering testimony into a permanent record. She described Operation Nightfall's planning structure. She described the intelligence gap that had resulted from a decision made at the command level, a decision that had exposed Detachment 7's position to hostile surveillance 18 hours before the mission's execution. She described the cascading errors that followed. She described the extraction, the 12 minutes of sustained overwatch fire from a single elevated position, maintained by a single operator, while the team below executed an emergency egress under conditions that had a documented survival probability of 31%. She did not say Elise's name during this part. She didn't need to. The room understood who had held that position. The room understood what holding that position had cost, not in the currency of medals and citations, in the currency of 3 years of silence, of a civilian cover identity, of a wife attending a memorial as a widow. Ryan Decker had covered the retreat with his body in the final 90 seconds of the extraction. That was in the record. The record was still classified above the level of most people in the room, but Norris was the classification authority, and she was choosing what to release. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Decker, Norris said, ensured that his partner could continue the mission. He did so with full understanding of the cost. She paused. Not for effect. She was not performing this. She was allowing a fact to complete its descent into a room that needed to receive it. That decision is the reason we have the intelligence we have today. That decision is why the operations planning failure is now documented and under formal review, rather than sealed in a file that protects the careers of those responsible for it. Styles said, "Admiral, these details are classified and this forum is not." "General." Norris turned to look at him, and her voice did not rise. It compressed. "I am the classification authority in this room. I am choosing what to release. You are welcome to contest that decision through the appropriate channels after this ceremony is complete." A breath. "You will have time to do so, Ivan Daus. You will have a great deal of time." The room received the subtext of that sentence the way a room receives the report of a distant detonation, felt before it is heard, understood before it is processed. Styles opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the wall of faces around him, families, officers, journalists, chaplains, and he recognized, with the clarity that comes when every available option has been considered and found unworkable, that there was nothing he could say in this room that would help him. Whatever he said would be on camera. Whatever he said would be in the room with 150 witnesses and a rear admiral who had been standing near a window in a plain coat since 9:32 that morning, specifically so that she could say exactly what she had just said. He looked at Elise. Elise was looking at the trident in her palm. She had picked it up. The chain had come fully free in the exchange, and she was holding it in her right hand, turned once in her fingers, unhurried. Then she raised it over her head and clasped it back at her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her dress, returning it to where it had been, where it belonged. She looked up at Styles. Operation Nightfall had a 92% casualty rate, she said. Her voice was for him, and it was for the room, and it was for the recording equipment, and it was for the families in the rows, and it was for the names on the wall behind the stage. The planning errors that caused it are in the official record, still classified. I have been waiting 3 years for someone with the authority to read them. She paused. Someone has. Styles stood in the front section of Naval Special Warfare Memorial Hall with 3 rows of decorations on his chest and 31 years of service behind him and nothing in front of him, except a room full of people who now understood what had happened in Kandahar province in March of 2021, and who understood who had been in that room all morning, and who understood what the dog had been telling them since 9:47. He did not speak again. Captain Foster materialized at his elbow, not hurrying because hurrying would have been its own statement, but present in the specific way that aides are present when their principals need to leave a room. Styles allowed himself to be guided toward the side corridor. He walked with the controlled pace of a man who has not decided yet whether what he is feeling is shame or strategy, and the question of which one it turns out to be will be answered by what he does in the next 48 hours. The door closed behind them. The room breathed. And then it was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet all morning. Not the held quiet of ceremony or the tension quiet of conflict, but the spent quiet that follows something real. Something that has been compressed for a long time and has finally, in the space of 4 minutes of a rear admiral's clear, steady voice, been allowed to expand to its actual size. Logan Hayes was still in the aisle. He had risen from his knee when Norris began speaking, and he was standing now with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Elise with the particular expression of a man for whom something that has been unresolved for years has just resolved, and the resolution is more complicated than relief and more specific than grief. He crossed to where she stood. He stopped in front of her. He was 6 inches taller and 25 years older, and he had the weathered face of someone who had carried operational weight for most of his adult life. And none of that was what was on his face right now. What was on his face was the expression of a man paying a debt. "He talked about you," Logan said. His voice was not for the room this time. It was at the bottom register, the place where words become private. Not by name, never by name. But every day in the field, every briefing, there was a moment where he'd say, "Covered," and I'd know it meant you were on the line. He trusted that like weather, like gravity. He paused. "I never thought I'd find out who." Elise looked at him. Her face was doing the thing it had done once that morning. The fraction of a degree that separates the training from the person underneath it, visible only for a moment, only to someone watching closely. "He was the best Overwatch I ever had," she said. It was not a eulogy, and it was not a comfort, and it was not a deflection. It was an operational assessment offered by one professional about another, in the language they both spoke. And it was the most specific tribute Elise Decker was capable of giving the man who had put his body between the incoming fire and her position in the last 90 seconds of a mission that should have killed them both. Logan nodded once. That was enough. Zara, who had maintained her working position against Elise's left leg through the entirety of the confrontation, shifted. She turned her head up toward Logan. Her ears came forward. Her tail moved once, a single slow arc, and then she was still again. It was the most she had moved since 9:47, when the general had entered the building, and it meant something specific that only a handler would fully understand. Logan looked at the dog for a long moment. "She remembered me," he said. "She remembers everyone from 7, Elise said. "That's what she was trained to do." The implications of that sentence took a moment to land. Trained to remember the unit, trained to recognize the general, trained, specifically, deliberately, with the long patience of someone preparing for a contingency, to growl at one and not the other, in a room full of witnesses, at a ceremony attended by journalists, on a morning when a rear admiral was standing near the window in a plain coat. Logan looked at Elise with the expression of a man reviewing a mission brief and understanding, for the first time, the full scope of it. "You planned this," he said, "not an accusation, a recognition." "Ryan planned it," Elise said. "I executed it." She picked up the 2 challenge coins from the armrests where Logan had placed them that morning. She had left them there through the ceremony, where anyone who looked could see them. 2 coins bearing the number 7, her number, sitting in the open in a room full of people, none of whom had the context to understand what they were looking at. She placed them in her palm. She held them for a moment. Then she handed them back to Logan. "Keep them," she said. "You earned yours." Colonel Sutton had approached during this exchange, and she stopped 2 feet away with the expression of a person who has spent the morning being wrong about something important and is now doing the difficult work of acknowledging that. She had a small envelope in her hand, the one Norris had produced from her jacket when Styles was being guided out, the one she had crossed the room and pressed into Sutton's hands without explanation. Sutton had opened it in the corner, read it twice, and was now standing with it in a way that suggested she was still processing the contents. "Colonel," Norris said, appearing at Sutton's shoulder with the quiet certainty of someone who has managed every piece of this morning's sequence. "You'll want to pass that to your staff judge advocate by end of day. It outlines the formal review timeline for Operation Nightfall's planning authorization chain." A pause. "Your name is not on that list, Diana. I wanted you to know that before you read any further." Sutton looked at Norris. Something in her shoulders released. Not much, but enough to be visible to anyone paying attention. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. She looked at Elise, the smooth social machinery that had carried her through every interaction that morning. The practiced warmth, the diplomatic redirection, the management of appearances, was gone. What was underneath it was not softer exactly. It was more honest. "Chief Warrant Officer," Sutton said, "I owe you a conversation, not today, but a conversation." "Any time," Elise said. Sutton nodded and moved toward the side corridor where her staff judge advocate was waiting. Lieutenant Brennan approached next, and he did it the way junior officers approach a situation they have contributed to and cannot retroactively undo, with the straight-backed resolution of someone who has decided to take it directly. He stopped in front of Elise and came to attention. Not a formal salute. This was not a setting that required it, and it would have felt like performance. He came to attention with the specific posture of someone standing accountable. "Chief Warrant Officer." His voice was tight but even. "I need to apologize for the questioning this morning. I was following a protocol I should have looked harder at before applying." A beat. "The question about the dog's injury. The level of detail you answered with. I should have recognized what that meant, and I didn't." Elise looked at him for a moment. "You were doing your job," she said. "You just didn't have all the information. That's not usually sufficient." "It was today," she said. "Learn to look closer next time, Lieutenant." Brennan held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded with the expression of a man filing something away at a cellular level and stepped back. Farley did not approach Elise directly. He was a man who understood his role in the morning's events and understood also that he had been used as an instrument of someone else's intentions, and his particular version of accountability was to remove himself from the center of the picture rather than add to it. He spoke briefly to Norris near the hall's side entrance, received a response that appeared to satisfy him in the minimal way that such responses can, and then took a position near the door that was clearly about being available rather than involved. Major Reed was the last of the 5, and his approach was the most complicated because his function all morning had been explicitly about how things appeared rather than what they were, and he was a man whose professional identity was tied to that function, and the morning had done significant damage to that identity. He stopped near Elise without quite stopping in front of her, an approach that had retained some of its sideways quality even now. "Chief Warrant Officer," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "That would be a change," Elise said without heat. Reed absorbed that. "Yes, I was managing optics. I was told the situation needed to be contained." He paused. "I'd like to think I would have handled it differently if I'd known." Elise looked at him with the level attention she had given everyone that morning. "The cameras are still running," she said. "What you do with the footage is going to say more about you than anything that happened before the reveal." A pause. "That's the optic that matters now." Reed looked at the camera operators who had returned to their positions after the ceremony's disruption and were continuing to record. He looked at the footage counter on the nearest camera. He looked at Elise. He nodded once, slowly, and walked to the nearest camera operator, and the conversation he had was not the one he would have had 2 hours earlier, and the footage remained intact. The formal program had technically concluded, but the hall was not emptying the way halls empty when a ceremony ends. People were standing in the specific way they stand when they are not ready to leave. Not because the event continues, but because they have not yet finished with what the event has given them. The Gold Star families had moved through several minutes of the specific kind of confused reorientation that follows learning something significant about a morning you thought you understood. Some of them had watched the confrontation and the revelation with the focused attention of witnesses. Others had watched with the slower comprehension of people receiving information that changes the context of everything they thought they knew about their own grief. Sarah Kimball had made her way through the rows to where Elise was standing. She was small, smaller than Elise, and she had the specific quality of someone who has been in a difficult thing for a long time and has gotten genuinely good at carrying it, which is different from recovering from it. She stopped in front of Elise. She looked at her for a moment without speaking, with the directness of someone who has run out of filters. Then she reached out and took Elise's hand. Both hands. She held Elise's right hand in both of hers, the way people hold something they want to make sure of. She didn't speak. Elise didn't speak. There are some things that don't have language, not because they're too small for words, but because they're too specific. They exist between two people in a particular configuration, and language would make them general, and general would make them wrong. Two women in a memorial hall, one who had held the line, and one whose husband had died holding it with her, standing with their hands together in a room full of other people's grief. That was sufficient. That was more than sufficient. It was enough to carry. When Elise looked up from Sarah Kimball's hands, she found an old woman standing at the edge of the moment. Eleanor Marsh, 71 years old, who had lost her son in Operation Nightfall and had been sitting in the front row all morning with a photograph pressed against her chest. She stood with the particular dignity of someone who has had a long time to practice being upright under weight. Behind her, holding her hand, was her grandson Thomas, 8 years old, with the straight-backed posture of a child who has been told today is important and has decided to act accordingly. He had been the child who approached Zara earlier, who had let the dog accept his hand, who had watched the morning unfold from the altitude of a child trying to understand the adult world. He was looking at Zara now, and then at Elise, with the specific attention of someone whose question has not yet been spoken. Eleanor Marsh said, "Thank you for bringing him home." It was a sentence that had been waiting, the kind of sentence that is assembled slowly over years and carried until the right moment, because releasing it to the wrong moment would diminish it, and the right moment had to be earned. Elise looked at her, at the photograph still in Eleanor's left hand, a young man in uniform, 32 years old, perpetually alive in the flat permanence of a photograph. "He brought himself home," Elise said. "I just held the line." Eleanor Marsh nodded. Not the nod of someone who agrees, the nod of someone who has received something and will carry it forward from here. She held Elise's gaze for a moment with the clear eyes of someone who has moved past what grief performs into what grief simply is. Then she stepped back, and Thomas stepped forward. He looked up at Elise, then at Zara, then back at Elise with the question ready. "Is she a hero dog?" Elise looked down at Zara, who was sitting exactly where she had been sitting since 9:15 that morning, pressed against her left leg, steady, attentive, present. "She did her job," Elise said. Thomas considered this. His brow worked through the calculation with the thoroughness of an 8-year-old processing something important. "Did you?" he asked. The question landed in the quiet that had gathered around them. Not accusatory, the opposite. It was the earnest inquiry of a child who wants confirmation of something he has already decided is true and needs a single word to confirm it. Elise looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. Thomas nodded once, with the solemn satisfaction of someone who has received a complete answer. He took his grandmother's hand again, and they moved back toward the front of the hall, where the chaplain was speaking quietly with a group of families. Norris appeared at Elise's shoulder. "Closing sequence," she said quietly, not asking, informing. "The formal review timeline is moving. Judge Advocate General's office received the initial brief at 08:30 this morning. The planning authorization chain for Nightfall will be under active review within 72 hours. She paused. "Stiles will have counsel by end of day. Whatever he does next is his choice, but the record is in motion." 3 years, Elise said. 3 years, Norris confirmed, without apology but not without acknowledgement. The thing about classified records is that declassifying them requires someone with the authority to do it, who also has the will to do it. Those two things don't always arrive at the same time. Elise was quiet. You could have pressed this sooner, Norris said, through other channels. It would have been messier and the outcome less certain, but the option existed. I wanted it to hold, Elise said. Messy things get appealed. Clean things get entered into the record and stay there. Norris looked at her with the expression of someone assessing a plan they hadn't known was being executed and finding that the execution was better than they would have designed. You built the whole morning around that. Ryan built the brief, Elise said. He filed the intelligence assessment in the 48 hours before the mission. He documented every planning deviation, every authorization gap. He knew what the casualty probability was when the command decision came through. He sent the assessment to a dead drop we'd established 6 months earlier. She paused. He knew that if the mission went the way the numbers said it would, the assessment needed to be somewhere retrievable. Somewhere that couldn't be swept into the same classification folder as the after-action review. He trusted you to retrieve it, Norris said. He trusted me to do what needed to be done with it, Elise said. There's a difference. Retrieving it was straightforward, doing something useful with it. That required waiting until the right room and the right witness set and the right authority. She glanced at the side door through which Stiles had been guided out by his aide. And the right dog, she said. Norris was quiet for a moment. She was already trained when you came to the ceremony, Norris said. The conditioning, that doesn't happen in a week. 18 months, Elise said. She knows his voice from recordings. She knows his cadence. She knows the particular way he moves in a formal setting. She looked at Zara. She was the part of the brief that couldn't be filed in a dead drop. She was the piece that had to be present in the room. The piece that had to be present in the room. A working dog trained over 18 months as a living demonstration, growling at the man whose command decision had created a 92% casualty rate in front of a hall full of journalists and Gold Star families and a rear admiral with classification authority. Not evidence in a legal sense. Evidence in the sense that the room needed to understand what the room had gathered for, not just to mourn the fallen, but to understand what had happened to them and who had decided to let it happen. Norris said, "The formal review will ask for your presence. You understand that?" "I'm available," Elise said. "It may require testimony you'd rather not give in a formal proceeding." "Ryan would have given it," Elise said. "He wrote it in a mission brief at 48 hours before a mission he didn't think he was coming back from. The least I can do is say it out loud." Norris looked at her for a moment with the clear attention of someone taking final measure of a person and arriving at a conclusion they'd held provisionally and are now confirming. "Your decompression status," Norris said. "You've been listed as active but inactive since 21. The operational review will clear your return to full status if you want it." Elise said nothing for a moment. "I'll let you know," she said. Norris nodded once and moved toward the stage to speak with the chaplain. "You just watched the moment everything collapsed. But this story isn't over yet. The consequences are still coming. For the general, for the families in that hall, and for the woman who spent years making sure this day would happen. Stay with us, and if this story hit you somewhere real, leave a comment below. Tell us, what does quiet strength mean to you? We read every single one. The hall was thinning now, families moving toward the exit in the gradual way of people who are not rushing because they understand that what has happened today will need time and distance before it can be fully absorbed. A few remained in small groups near the name panels on the wall, speaking quietly. A chaplain moved among them. The camera operators were packing their equipment with the careful attention of people who understand they are carrying something significant. Logan Hayes was standing near the center of the room when Elise reached him. He had been there for the past 10 minutes, with the settled quality of a man who is not waiting for anything specific, but is not ready to leave. He looked at her when she stopped beside him. "What happens now?" he asked. "I go back," she said. "Back where?" "To work." He was quiet for a moment. Is there a unit? Are you... "That's classified," she said. Then, after a pause, "In the register that carries a different kind of information than its literal meaning." Ask me in 6 months. Logan looked at her. He had been carrying the weight of surviving a mission where everyone else didn't for 4 years, and that weight doesn't resolve in the way simpler debts resolve. It redistributes, it changes shape, it becomes part of the structure of how you move through the world. But something in it had shifted this morning. Something load-bearing had been adjusted, and he was not yet sure what the new configuration felt like, but he was fairly certain it was more sustainable than what had preceded it. Ryan talked about you every day in the field, he said again. He never said your name, but I always knew when he meant you. He looked at Zara. She takes care of herself in the field? She takes care of me, Elise said, has since the first day. Logan reached down and set his right hand lightly on the top of Zara's head. Zara looked up at him with the calm attentiveness she had shown him since the Isle. She held his hand under her chin for a moment, then she looked back at Elise. Logan straightened. He held out his right hand. Not the challenge coin grip, not the informal gesture, but the full formal handshake of two people with a shared operational history. Elise took it. They shook hands in the middle of the hall where 150 people had gathered to mourn, in a room where names were carved into walls and the light came in from the east and the day had arrived exactly where it needed to arrive. He chose well, Logan said. We both did, she said. She gathered Zara's leash and they moved toward the rear of the hall, through the side corridor, toward the building's service exit that opened onto the parking area. The sound of the ceremony's aftermath faded behind her. Voices, the movement of chairs, the efficient work of people restoring an event space to its neutral state. The service exit opened onto an empty stretch of asphalt at the building's eastern end. The October light was clean and direct, the kind of light that makes everything slightly more itself. Elise pushed through the door and Zara moved beside her into the open air, and for a moment they stood there with the door closing behind them and the parking area ahead of them and the sound of the memorial hall sealed on the other side of a wall. Elise looked at the sky for a moment. Not a long look, a brief one. The kind you take when you have been inside under controlled lighting for several hours and your eyes require recalibration. Then she walked to the car. She opened the rear door. Zara loaded herself without instruction, one easy movement from the ground to the back seat, a motion so practiced it had become part of the fabric of their daily existence, as reflexive as breathing. Elise closed the door and moved to the driver's side. She sat for a moment without starting the engine. In her hand, without her quite deciding to take it out, was the Trident. She had unclasped it again in the corridor, and she was holding it in her right palm with the practiced contact of something handled many thousands of times. The metal was warm from the morning's wearing. The engraving on the back was invisible to her at this angle, but she knew every character of it without needing to see. NSW Gachnoi DEVGRU Gachnoi F Gachnoi Bay Gachnoi VEIL Gachnoi ACTIVE. She had worn this under her clothes for 3 years. She had worn it to grocery stores and physical therapy appointments and the quiet walks by the water that she took when the silence got too heavy in the apartment that used to contain 2 people. She had worn it because Ryan had clasped it around her neck in the forward operating base at 0500 on the morning of the Nightfall insertion, in the specific way he had of doing important things without making them into more than they were. Carry this home, he had said, not bring this back, not keep this safe, carry this home. The verb was specific. Carrying implies weight. Carrying implies that the thing being carried requires effort, requires commitment, requires someone willing to keep walking even when walking is the hardest available option. She had carried it home. She was home. She pressed the Trident once in her palm and then clasped it back around her neck and tucked it beneath her collar, and she started the engine. Her phone rang before she had shifted into drive. The number on the screen was not a contact. It was a string of characters beginning with the prefix OP-, in the format used by a specific class of operational communications that did not appear in consumer phone directories and did not exist in any network traceable to any agency with a public name. She picked it up on the second ring without speaking. The voice on the other end was neutral in the specific way that trained voices are neutral, not flat, not processed, but stripped of all regionality and effect, carrying information without personality. Vale. Package confirmed. You're cleared for next phase. She looked out through the windshield at the parking area at the empty stretch of asphalt leading back to the Memorial Hall's service entrance. "Who's the primary?" she said. A pause. 1 second. The measured pause of someone who has the information and is deciding how much of it to release over an open line. "Someone you've been watching longer than today." She sat with that for a moment. In the back seat, Zara shifted, and Elise could see the dog's eyes in the rearview mirror. That specific amber watchfulness that she had looked at across hundreds of hours of planning and preparation and the long empty stretches that operational waiting requires. "What's the timeline?" she said. "We'll send the brief, standard channel. Give yourself 48 hours. "Understood." She ended the call. She placed the phone in the center console. She put both hands on the steering wheel. In the mirror, Zara was looking at her with the calm attentiveness that had been present since the first day of their partnership. Through the training progressions and the operational assessments and the missions that appeared in no record accessible to a 2-star general and the 3 years of civilian cover and this particular morning, in a hall full of names on a wall in Virginia Beach. Elise held Zara's gaze in the mirror for a moment. "Good girl," she said. Zara's ears moved forward. Elise looked back at the road. The Memorial Hall was behind her. The formal review was in motion. The record was in motion. 3 years of preparation, the dead drop, the brief, the training, the 18 months of conditioning that had made a Belgian Malinois into a living piece of evidence capable of standing in a room full of witnesses and communicating something no document alone could have communicated. All of it had resolved into this morning, into 4 minutes of a rear admiral's clear, steady voice, into the sound of a trident against a black dress, in a room where 150 people were finally, after 3 years, hearing the truth about what had happened in Kandahar province in March of 2021. Ryan Decker had planned for a contingency. He had understood that the mission's casualty probability meant the plan needed to survive without him. He had documented everything with the precision of an operator who understood that documentation was itself a form of action. He had filed it where it could be retrieved. He had trusted the person beside him to know what to do with it. She had known. She pulled out of the parking area. The road ahead was clear. The October light fell across the asphalt in the direct way of morning light that has not yet committed to the day's full weight. She drove. Behind her, inside the hall, the families were still there, speaking with each other and with the chaplain, holding photographs and programs, doing the difficult particular work of carrying grief forward into the rest of their lives. The name panels on the walls held their names in stone. The recording equipment held the morning's events in its memory. The coins that Logan had left and Elise had returned were in his jacket pocket. The trident was at her neck. And somewhere ahead, on a timeline that would resolve in 48 hours, there was another room, another record, another person who had made a decision that needed to be accounted for. Someone she had been watching longer than today, and the phrase had weight because it was true, because Nightfall had not been a single decision by a single person but a chain. And she had followed the chain for 3 years and arrived this morning at the link she could reach, and the link she could not yet reach was ahead of her, and she was moving toward it. The morning had been the beginning. She had built it to look like an ending. The reveal, the accountability, the families receiving something that resembled closure. She had built all of it with the precision of a woman who understood that the most effective cover for the next phase of a mission is a completed-looking previous phase. The memorial wasn't the mission. The memorial was the cover. She drove north into the clean October light with a dog in the back seat and a trident at her neck and 3 years of patience converting quietly, efficiently into whatever came next. She was not finished. She was not close to finished. She was exactly where the mission required her to be. And no one in that building, not the families, not the chaplain, not the journalists reviewing their footage, not the admiral who had provided the cover that made this morning possible, knew where she was going. Only the voice on the other end of an untraceable phone number. And Zara, who had always known, and who was watching the road through the back window of a moving car with the settled alertness of a working dog that understands, in the wordless and complete way of working dogs, that the job is not over and will not be over until the person she has been assigned to protect decides that it is. She had not decided that. The road stretched ahead. The mission continued. Real warriors don't advertise. They carry their record in the places where the dress covers it, in the weight of what the dog was trained to remember, in the 3-second pause before a name is called at a wall full of names. They carry it until the moment it needs to be seen. and then they let it be seen, completely, without performance. And they're already moving toward the next thing, before the room has finished understanding the last. If this story reached something in you, leave us a comment. We read every one. And if you know someone who carries more than they show, share this with them today. Subscribe for more stories that live in the space between the record and the truth. We'll see you in the next one.